Today's tour takes us to the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historic Park in Johnson City, Texas. Unlike the previous tour where we looked at LBJ's ranch and home in the Texas White House, this tour is going to take us through the very early years of Lyndon Baines Johnson. You have to imagine Johnson City as it was about 100 or more years ago, maybe 150 years ago. There was no plumbing, no electricity, unpaved streets, no place to buy a loaf of bread or a pound of meat, a cafe that sometimes hung out a sign closed for lunch, a courthouse, a cotton gin, a ramshackle hotel, and 3 churches. This was the Johnson City of Lyndon B. Johnson's youth. Here, comfort and amusement came mostly from one's family, friends, and neighbors. Many of the buildings that we'll see in Johnson City from the early days still stand. That strong sense of community that forever attracted Lyndon Johnson back to this place still endures. When Lyndon Johnson's father, Sam Johnson Jr., purchased the home at 200 Elm Street in 1913, he also acquired a whole city block. The family's lot was 1.75 acres, and it looked very different in the early 20th century. The landscape here was much more exposed, with few shade trees and just some really small low brush. The dirt yard was home to various farm animals such as a mule, a milking cow, a goat, a pig, and maybe some chickens. While the house that we'll see here in just a bit is original, other structures have been reconstructed. Lyndon Johnson's family moved to Johnson City from a farm near Stonewall, a distance of about 14 miles. The move took place in September 1913, just about 2 weeks after Lyndon's 5th birthday. For most of the next 24 years, this was their home. The Johnson family included Lyndon's parents, Sam Johnson and Rebecca Baines Johnson, and Lyndon's 4 siblings, his sister Rebecca, Josepha, Lucia, and brother Sam Houston Johnson. The family life that Lyndon Johnson experienced here as he grew to adulthood strongly influenced the man who would become the 36th President of the United States. This building here that sits behind the boyhood home of Lyndon Baines Johnson is known as the Smokehouse. This two-room structure was a multifunctional building. The Johnsons recalled their father Sam using this room for smoking meats. The restroom also had a playroom for the children, but it also had shelves for their mother Rebecca, who could keep books and magazines here. This lean-to shed had laundry tubs and a large iron pot for holding lard. Who's that pot? The windmill and water tank were located near a big live oak tree behind the house. The windmill, here we go, here's the windmill, was what's known as a Dempster model, and the water tank was originally situated in a tank house. For many years, the Johnson family did not have indoor plumbing. However, by the early 1920s, they had gravity-fed water to their house. Using wind power, the windmill would draw the water from the well into a storage tank, and from there, the water would flow by pressure or gravity through pipes underneath the ground to the house. Back in this corner of the lot behind the LBJ's home, boyhood home, was the outhouse. Notice it's situated quite a ways back from the house. Outhouses were very common in rural areas that did not have the benefit of plumbing. Johnson City residents, as well as a few businesses in town, all relied upon outhouses well into the 1930s. The Johnson family renovated their house in 1934, and at that point it saw the addition of indoor plumbing and a toilet inside. Head up to the family barn. The original Johnson barn was a post-frame structure with a raised roof described as a shed barn with a loft. While the loft was used for hay storage, the central areas was where Father Sam Johnson would park the family car. Around age 10 or so, a young Lyndon Johnson fell from the hayloft and broke his leg. This current structure was originally built in the 1920s in a farm near Albert, Texas, about 15 miles southwest of Johnson City, and it was moved here in 1972. While it's not an exact replica of the original Johnson barn, it stands as a typical type of barn from the 1920s. The original barn was torn down in the 1950s by Lyndon Johnson's aunt, Frank Martin, who was living on the property at the time. Across the street from LBJ's boyhood home is the Pedernales Electric Co-op. This is actually the modern headquarters of the Pedernales Electric Co-op, or PEC. When Lyndon Johnson was growing up, Johnson City had no electricity, and that was a very common occurrence at the time in people in the rural areas in the United States. People relied on kerosene lanterns for lighting, on windmills, horses, and the occasional gasoline motor for other jobs that were too difficult to perform by hand. In 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt created the Rural Electrification Administration, which encouraged rural areas to develop electrical grids by providing low-cost loans and other aid. The progress was difficult, and there were significant challenges such as minimum population density requirements that needed to be overcome. Basically, you needed to have enough people in an area to put in electricity. Newly elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1937, Lyndon Johnson immediately began lobbying the Roosevelt administration to waive the population density requirement. Meanwhile, local representatives across 5 Texas counties sought support from area ranchers and residents, and in May 1938, the Pedernales Electric Cooperative was established. Later that year, Congressman Johnson was able to secure federal funds, and construction began on the infrastructure that would eventually bring electricity and the modern era to the Texas Hill Country. As we leave LBJ's childhood home, take a quick tour of what Johnson City, Texas looks like today. This is the United States Post Office and a federal office building for Johnson City, Texas. It's built in 1969 and modeled on what many of the structures look like in this area that were built 125 years ago, and many of those still stand today. Johnson City itself is a fairly small town in the Texas Hill Country. Fredericksburg to the west is a much bigger town. And back when LBJ was a child living here, was not near the size of town it is today. But as you can see by looking at many of the structures, not much has changed over the past 90 to 100 years. Take a step down here. Small city park, little bandstand. As you travel around this area, you'll notice a large number of wineries. In fact, I believe there's over 50 wineries in just this area. The wineries make for have a huge tourist impact on this area.
That's a new one? Yeah.
The town of Johnson City was founded in 1879 by James Polk Johnson, a relative of President Lyndon Johnson. The county seat for Blanco County was moved to the new town in 1890, and the town of Blanco 15 miles away. This current courthouse was constructed in 1916. Notice many of these buildings are built of native limestone. Most are late 1800s, early 1900s when they were built. The old Johnson County Bank.
Wait, cross.
We're going to start heading into what's called the Johnson Settlement Trail. This trail will kind of give us an example of what this area of Johnson City and this area of the Hill Country looked like probably back before LBJ was born. This was the area that his relatives settled. Before there was a town of Johnson County, or Johnson City, the central area of Blanco County was simply known as the Johnson's Ranch. It was from here that the president's grandfather and great uncle drove cattle up the Chisholm Trail in the late 1860s to those railheads in Kansas. Take a look at what the prairie looked like and some of the early structures that were built 50, 60, 70 years before LBJ was born. This structure here that we're looking at is now the education center for the LBJ National Historic Park. It was built in 1900, and it was originally the home of the George T. Bryan family. This particular home is very much in the style of the architecture that would have been around during the times of LBJ's youth in the early 20th century. LBJ's family settled in the Texas Hill Country in the roughly mid 1800s. His grandfather, Sam Johnson Sr., was a cattle drover, rounding up cattle from here in the Hill Country and herding them along the Chisholm Trail to the railheads in Abilene, Kansas. From there, the cattle were sold to growing eastern cities with a large demand for beef. Cows like that. Longhorn cows. This particular trail will take us on a look at what the settlement looked like in about 1870, and there are several original structures along the trailhead, or along the trail. Abundant timber, really tall grasses, and seemingly adequate water lured the Hill Country's first settlers to this land. But the land deceived them. Only a thin layer of really poor soil sustained this lush landscape. The virgin grasses that attracted the first settlers were the product not of one growing season as it was back in the East or the upper Midwest, but of dozens of different types of growing seasons. Once consumed by cattle and sheep, the grass regenerated slowly. Crops of cotton and corn thrived in the first years, but by 1890, per acre yields had dropped by as much as 2/3. Prosperity gave way to a toilsome struggle for survival. Today, brush, cedars, and many non-native grasses dominate a land that was once bursting with wild grapes, wild plums, persimmons, and agarita bushes. Where there was once native cypress trees, now there are pecan trees. Where once this land was wild, you can see the handprint of man most everywhere you look. It truly is a land that's been transformed by man. For 5 years, from 1867 to 1872, This cabin was the home of Samuel Johnson and his wife Eliza. While Sam ran the family's cattle business, Eliza attended by hand to virtually every detail of running the ranch. She hauled water, spun wool, made clothes, cooked meals, and tended the animals. Self-sufficiency was a must. The nearest store was in Blanco, about a day's ride away. The Johnson cabin is typical of the dog trot cabins that were once common in Texas. The west wing was built first, and then it was built first about 1856. See if we can take a look inside here. It's a little dark.
Welcome to the Johnson settlement. My name is Lucy Baines Johnson, and I'm the younger daughter of Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson. If you want to know the facts about life in the hill country for the 36th president of the United States, go ask a park ranger. But if you'd like to know some of the family lore, please come. Sit by me, and I'll tell you a tale. Back in the 1850s, there were two brothers, Tom and Sam Johnson. Their ambition was to run cattle up the Chisholm Trail, and so they did. But life interrupted this great dream. Onset of the Civil War and joining the Confederacy became the fate of Tom and Sam, as it did countless people across our great country. After the war was over, Tom and Sam returned, and Sam brought with him his beautiful bride, Eliza Button. Eliza and Sam Johnson moved in, and Eliza tried to make this log cabin not just a house, but a home. She brought with her an
John Bruckner, a German immigrant, purchased the property in 1882 from James Polk Johnson as an investment property, and he originally farmed the home with his brother Christian Bruckner. Before moving to the property himself, Bruckner made many upgrades to the living quarters. The log cabins that had once belonged to Sam Johnson Sr. and Eliza Johnson. He also constructed several stone buildings, including this barn in 1884. It was built in the German style and is similar to stone buildings built by the Pennsylvania Dutch settlers in central Pennsylvania. In 1872, Sam and Eliza Johnson left their frontier property after a successful run in the cattle business. 100 years later, their grandson, President Lyndon Johnson, would help fund the purchase of this property by the National Park Foundation in 1972. The few original structures still present at that time were restored to their historic 19th century appearance. Sam Johnson, Sr., his brother Tom, and 3 of their nephews ran cattle from this settlement after the Civil War during the boom years for the cattle industry until the Johnsons dissolved their business in 1871. The Johnson brothers sold their land to their nephew, James Polk Johnson. In 1879, at a spring barbecue, the settlers in the area voted for James's property on the Pedernales River to be the site of the new town, which was named in his honor, Johnson City. In 1882, some of the land known as the original Johnson Ranch was sold to the Bruckner family, who resided there for nearly a century. This particular barn, or this structure, has been restored to what it looked like in 1880. It originally contained a corn crib, hay loft, granary, tack room, mule stall, and wagon storage. It was built by James Polk Johnson, founder of the town of Johnson City, and nephew to Sam Johnson Sr., President Johnson's grandfather. This windmill, which is known as a cyclone windmill, was situated above the well that pumped cold well water into the adjoining storage tank. Its many blades allowed for the windmill to hold up to the pressure of strong winds and still generate enough torque to pump water from the well during periods of low wind. The well water then flowed by gravity through a pipe to the wooden water trowel inside the cooler house. Wind was an important resource that settlers harnessed. The water tank is an essential part of the pumping process. It stores water above the height of where it will be used and then is gravity fed into water trowels and buildings. No electricity or mechanical energy source is required for this part of the process. The little stone house sitting next to the side is what's known as a cooler house. It was built in the 1880s by N.T. Stubbs, a cousin by marriage to President Lyndon Johnson. The cooler house provided cold storage for perishable food and dairy products. It was constructed out of native limestone with walls over 18 inches thick. Inside, shelves were built along the thick stone walls for storage of crocks filled with wild dewberries, hog plums, and garden vegetables such as onions, peas, beans, and tomatoes. Cans of milk and churns filled with cream for making butter were kept cool in the wooden water trough. Eggs preserved in salt and cabbage stored in barrels for making sauerkraut were kept on the cool, moist sand floor, while potatoes and other root vegetables were stored in a large box layered with sand to keep them dry. Because of his love for this land, respect for his pioneer ancestors, and his devotion to both, Lyndon Johnson has been called the last of the frontier presidents. Confederate veteran Samuel Eli Johnson Sr. and his wife, Eliza Bunton Johnson, Lyndon Johnson's grandparents, settled here in 1867. From this ranch, Sam and his brother Tom drove cattle north on the Chisholm Trail. Cattle like this longhorn cow that you see right here in front of you. They amassed a massive fortune driving cattle up into Kansas. In 1870 alone, they returned with over $100,000 in gold coins. That would have been millions and millions in today's dollars. I hope you enjoyed this tour of Johnson City, LBJ's boyhood home, as well as this walk around the original Johnson settlement. If you like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next walking tour. Thanks. Bye-bye.